Hey guys, Drifter here. Today I wanted to offer you some analysis on the Nickmercs situation, and I do mean serious analysis, not clickbait, not rage bait, culture wars, or any of that other weird stuff that this event has spawned. What we're going to be doing is a top-down analysis of exactly what happened, who said what, how people reacted. Then we'll be taking a look at it from three different perspectives, being the LGBTQ community, the corporate perspective, and then the conservative community, before finally I offer some of my own opinions at the very end. It seems very topical because it's Pride Month. Oh, I would have liked to have a more positive Pride Month video, but it does seem perfect for this channel because it's a microcosm of the greater culture wars going on around us, and it's one of these rare places where politics bleeds directly into video games and then comes back around and goes mainstream. So it gets a little crazy, and in case you're wondering why I'm doing this 12 days after the event, it's because as soon as it happened, I got the RSV that's been going around, and it gave me a fever and blew up my throat for the better part of a week. So we're definitely slow on the draw here. Probably a little bit more editing than usual today because I'm going to have to take a moment to reset my voice every now and then. All right, so first up, let's talk about what happened. Nickmercs put out a tweet saying, if I can find it here, they should leave the little children alone in response to something that Puckett posted about anti-LGBTQ protesters fighting pro-LGBT protesters outside of a school in Glendale, California. And we'll come back to this later. So he put out that tweet. It offended the gay community, and then Nickmercs kind of had a non-apology here. It wasn't exactly corporate PR friendly. So Call of Duty responded by removing his skin from the store. This was the first ever creator skin that Call of Duty has ever done, and it was a huge deal, huge big marketing commitment, spend, development, all that, and they just straight up pulled it. There is here's the corporate Call of Duty response. Due to recent events, we have removed the Nickmercs operator bundle from the Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone store. We are focused on celebrating Pride with our employees and our community, and this is Alex Zedra that we will loop back around to later, another COD influencer, and maybe technically the first person to have her own skin. So after those tweets, Activision decided to go ahead and pull the skin from the store. Now, as you may know, Nickmercs is very good friends with Tim the Tatman, and Tim the Tatman said that he wanted to stand in solidarity with Nickmercs and requested that his skin also be removed from the store. And lo and behold, it was in a short matter of time. Dr. Disrespect uninstalled Call of Duty, went on a boycott, demands an apology to Nickmercs for removing the skin, among other things. And then looping back around to Alex Zedra, who was Mara in the game, a streamer, model, influencer. She had a lot of things built off of her. It was paid for modeling work, so it wasn't quite like a creator skin. Also, she's at like every Trump rally, man, like front and center. You can see her right there. She pays for those premium seats. First thing she says to Call of Duty is, found the pedo, and some other kind of unpleasant stuff as it goes on through. So that's what happened. There are some other tweets to add a little bit of context to this. Nickmercs lives in Florida. He was talking about Florida is the best state in the country. Other people are arguing Florida is run by an asshat, in a way it's the best state. You mean the GOAT, referring to Ron DeSantis, and says keep your dumbass up there in boo-foo-foo land, which means buttfuck land. So probably not a good look there either. And that is how and why the skin got pulled. And I wanted to add a little bit more context for this tweet in case a lot of you missed it. So this is Puckett tweeting, this happened 4 blocks from my Overwatch League apartment. Americans are in a sad place right now. Let people love who they love and live your own life. So I'll play a little bit. This is a fight where Armenian dads and Spanish dads showed up to fight Antifa and pro-LGBTQ protesters outside of a school in Glendale, California. The school was getting ready to have a board meeting to vote on whether or not to include LGBTQ stuff in history and science classes, and whether they were going to recognize Pride Month. And I think where it went really off the rails is one of the teachers, you know, being in California, was very left of center, and she had this very long quote for social media talking about the Judeo-Christian, patriarchal, imperialist, capitalist system that oppresses the students. And once that happened, it just pretty much went off the rails. So in case you don't know, Armenian and Spanish communities are typically very conservative, very family values, very anti-LGBTQ. So the school where where they're going to have this vote has a disproportionate number of these people, and they don't want LGBT stuff being taught to their kids, which is why, or one of many reasons, that this turned into such a big disaster. And then, of course, the message that Nickmercs has under there, they should leave little children alone. that's the real issue, which seems innocent enough on face value, seems simple. I was a little surprised they canceled over this, but this is where we are going to take a little break. I'm going to rest my voice, and we're going to swap over and take a look at this from the LGBTQ community's perspective to see why it was so offensive to them. It should be noted before we go much further that I am not a member of the LGBTQ community. I'm about as straight as they get, so explaining their perspective is done through the lens of research and after conversations with people in that community and them giving me their feedback. So the LGBTQ community, which I'll probably say gay community or queer community for moving forward here, it rolls off the tongue a little bit easier and the voice is still a little rough, believes that Nickmercs' comment, "they should leave the little children alone," is actually a dog whistle that's used to imply that gays are pedophiles. In case you're unfamiliar with the concept of the political dog whistle, it's something that you can use to silently signal others of your belief. It's usually for something repugnant, like saying inner city crime is a euphemism for black people are bad, or they had the "it's okay to be white" movement during Juneteenth a few years back and stuff like that. It's something that is often, it looks really good and simple and okay in the sentence, but it's not meant to be used that way. It's meant to signal other people or to imply something like gays are pedophiles, and that if you allow them into the schools, if you allow them to teach your children, they're going to prey upon your children. So the goal with this particular dog whistle, and it's a very common one these days, is to equate the entirety of the LGBTQ community with groomers, predators, and pedophiles. It's kind of an old school scapegoating tactic that opinion leaders today still use, because it's not the 70s and 80s anymore where it could be very literally illegal to be gay. You could go to jail for that. At least I saw them rounding people up in the late 60s. These days, you can't make it illegal to be gay. But much like the war on drugs was designed to criminalize people's political opponents, you can conflate the idea of homosexuality with pedophilia as if they are so intertwined. It's one thing. You can't be one thing or the other. It has to be both. And you can criminalize pedophilia and grooming and things like that, thus criminalizing the gay community. It's similar to troll movements like MAPS, and this has come up massively recently thanks to the brilliant but evil success of Gays Against Groomers. That's a very popular Twitter account. But fun fact, Gays Against Groomers was founded and run by people from Arsenal Media Group, which was actually a conservative digital strategy and counter strategy think tank, and also people from X Strategies, which does a pretty similar thing. So fun. And the way this works is that people hear this a lot in media over and over and over. And it's not often overt. It's not often anti-gay. It's not often particularly offensive, but it kind of builds up in people's psyche so that, for example, I'll give you a story from my personal life. This was from the 90s. I went to a new school. My mom came in with me. We met all the teachers. There was one male teacher and he had a lisp. I do not know if he was gay or not. Just a guy, had a lisp. I think he taught home ec or something like that. And the very moment my mom identified this guy as maybe being gay, it was like a switch went off in her head. She got very defensive, investigative, agitated, angry. And she said that she saw this man use his hip and groin area to thrust a little girl's face to knock her back into line. I personally did not see this, but it set her off and she was shaking for the better part of our tour. Then went to the principal to complain about it, and I got to hear the same story being told a few times over, every time becoming more exaggerated, because she was mortified that this possibly gay man was there sexually assaulting children and getting away with it based on that. That person got fired. I never had any classes under them. If they did the face hump thing, I sure as heck didn't see it when I was a kid. But that's a good example of how it can be used to demonize the LGBTQ community, to dehumanize them perhaps, and thus you can attempt to criminalize them. So let's loop back around. Obviously, when the gay community sees stuff like this, where they try to conflate a gender or an orientation to predation and grooming and stuff like that, they push back very, very hard against it. That's kind of the biggest dog whistle they've been fighting at the moment, because they've been fighting really hard to include some information about their community from a scientific and historical perspective into schools. The goal here is really desensitization so that kids don't grow up like violently anti-gay, like a gay person touches you and you break their jaw in 7 places. They're kind of pushing hard against stuff like that. Yeah, they're not big fans of stuff like the gay panic defense. You should look that one up sometimes. For a long time, you were able to legally kill gay people when they surprised you, if they hit on you or touched you or stuff like that, because the gay panic was so strong. So they're trying to desensitize kids against this stuff and get kids more used to it so that hopefully in the future there's less violent attacks and greater acceptance. But because they're focusing on kids, the people that oppose the gay community work very hard to try to conflate that focus to a focus of grooming, that they're only there to groom, that they want to grow these kids into future members of their community or just take advantage of them as is. So the gay community pushes back very, very, very hard against comments like this. They more or less have a hard line in the sand against this, and they're fighting the grooming accusations just tooth and nail all the way down. So that is why the gay community or LGBTQ community was so offended by Nickmercs' tweet and why it was such a big deal for Activision. Now I'm going to rest my voice again, and we're going to be back in just a moment for the corporate perspective. The corporate perspective on this issue is all about profits. Shouldn't be a big surprise there, but based on my educational background in business school and my experience working in and around the corporate environment in the gaming industry for decades now, I have a pretty good perspective on how corporations operate and why they make the decisions they do, like removing operator skins. So we'll start off with a very simple fact that corporate PR these days has a very, very big rule that you might have heard of called "Don't offend the gays." That has a tendency to be a very expensive mistake. People boycott, they brigade, they cancel, they do weird things with stock prices. That's sort of across the political spectrum these days, but having your company being labeled as anti-LGBTQ is very, very bad, and Activision doesn't want any sort of boycott or protest or something like that. There's also an issue with a sort of new morality that has come to be ever present, and it was always here a little bit, but has grown now. And this new moral value is that funding people with opinions is an endorsement of those opinions. Not everybody believes this, or not everybody believes that it should be this way. But when it comes to spokespersons, if you are funding this spokesperson and making their face the face of your corporation, your game, your brand, whatever, whatever they say and do in their private life inherently reflects back onto the brand in varying degrees depending on how people feel about it. And these days, people do pretty much take a spokesperson to be the voice of the company. So what Activision did not want in this situation is, since Nickmercs was the face of the game for the time being with his operator skin, they didn't want Activision as anti-LGBT. Activision funds anti-LGBT. Activision funds hate, stuff like that. It generally would generate a lot of bad press, and this whole thing was just kind of an embarrassing start to the creator skin system. I think that they wanted a much stronger, happier, and celebrated start instead of a political culture war issue right off the rip. So as such, they decided to pull the skin so that they did not be perceived as funding or agreeing with any potentially homophobic statements. That way they avoid bad press, they avoid bad PR, they avoid boycotts and stuff like that. On top of this, I do want to talk about the fact that Nickmercs almost certainly signed a behavior clause in his contract. I have done a ton of sponsorship deals in my life, even a number of them with Activision, and the majority of sponsorship deals do come with a behavior clause. Sometimes the behavior clause is very simple. Sometimes it's very open to where the corporation can just kind of kick you out no matter what. And I've had some that are incredibly long and list specific topics and issues and communities and stuff that you can't denigrate or insult or drag down. And I've also been on the other end of being canceled. I've been up for review by corporations. That was back during my harassment days. People took an anti-racism video where I told stories about some of the horrible stuff that I experienced growing up and clipped those out of context, so it just kind of sounded like me saying the N-word over and over and over again. So I got to have a really fun corporate meeting about that one. But the point is, behavior clauses are pretty typical. Nickmercs may have stepped outside of that, so there's pretty good legal grounds there. And now let's talk about Call of Duty as a corporation just a little bit. They're kind of having the same problem that a lot of American corporations do, and I'm going to compare them to Bud Light in this instance. So Bud Light had like a trans influencer. They got boycotted. They're not America's #1 beer and stuff like that. And you would ask, why would they do that? Why would they trash their brand that way? And the reality is very simple. Gen Z and millennials are not drinking a lot of alcohol. Alcohol sales in that group is going way down. And almost every major alcohol manufacturer in the United States realizes that their customer base is dying, that they're aging out, and they have to appeal to the youth. So that's why they're doing LGBTQ stuff and more progressive stuff. And it's kind of the same thing in Call of Duty. Call of Duty as a brand for a very long time has been at least loosely associated with conservatism because of its military nature and veteran support and stuff like that. And gun nuts love the game. But it's always been a little bit more conservative. However, those people are aging out. They're like my age or older. They're not gaming as much. They're not consuming the product. And what Activision, their core age group for Call of Duty is still probably going to be about 15 to 25, high school and college. That's all Gen Z. That's younger Gen Z. And what does Gen Z like? Gen Z likes LGBTQ representation. Gen Z likes progressive values. Gen Z has different stances on social issues than people of my generation. So Call of Duty is, in the same way, having to choose between the older conservative audience and the up-and-coming audience, and quite wisely, they choose the younger audience. On top of that, you got to keep in mind this corporation is based out of California, which has totally different political beliefs than most people would have here in, say, Texas. And on top of that, a large number of their employees are probably LGBTQ in some capacity, or at least consider themselves to be an ally, or at least involved in the movement. So when it comes to keeping your employees happy, sometimes you have to do things like this in order to appease them and maintain good work morale. This is something that even, I think it's, who was Yolinda, the new Twitter CEO, the one that Elon Musk hired. She literally was on Trump's sports council. She ran NBC, but people accused her of being woke because she did like little progressive things like Stop AAIP and Pride Month and stuff like that, because in doing so, it made the employees happy and kept them working longer. There's another story about a different corporation that I actually can't tell because that's private, about basically the same thing. But from a corporate perspective, there is serious value in keeping your employees happy and making your employees feel that the company is not against them. So hopefully that explains the corporate perspective on this. Activision essentially didn't want to be labeled as a homophobic company, and they didn't want to be labeled as endorsing these opinions. And on top of that, they're trying to appeal to a younger audience and keep their employees happy. So that's why they made the decision they did. Explaining the conservative perspective is going to be the most difficult part of this video for me because I find myself increasingly distant from that community over time, and the further I get away from it, the more brain power it takes to step back in and understand things from that perspective. So I'm going to try my very best to explain it. Hopefully I don't get this wrong. And there's a lot to talk about, but let's start off with a very short and simple one before getting into some of the meaty stuff, which is that a lot of conservatively minded people don't agree with the spokesperson equals endorsement situation that we talked about in the corporate perspective, that a spokesperson's opinions are not necessarily reflective of the corporation and that they should not be punished for said opinions. Same with actors losing roles and people getting canceled for a lot of Trump stuff, really, or people getting canceled for anti-vaccine stuff. They believe that what you do for your work, be acting, spokesperson, radio, whatever, should not really be affected by your opinions outside of work. So that's just a pretty huge ideological difference right there off the rip. Pretty simple, easy to understand, but now let's move into the meaty stuff. A lot of people believe that teaching children about sex inherently sexualizes them in some way, because how could it not? Kids that previously knew nothing about sex now do know about sex, and they know that they can be sexually active or they can do these things, and these things are available. It's kind of like eating the forbidden fruit in the Bible, that attaining that knowledge does in some way sexualize them, and that it's very difficult to do sex education without some degree of sexual awakening in the children themselves. And because of this, it is the role of the parents and not the school, not the government, and not society to teach children what they need to know about sex and at what age. A lot of parents probably feel that they are being intruded upon by having society force sex education onto kids, especially little kids. And there's a widespread belief that sex education shouldn't be for little kids, that what do grade schoolers need in terms of sex ed? And the answer might be nothing. And this particular doesn't have anything to do with the LGBTQ community, gay community, or otherwise. It's just that little kids don't need to learn about sex. And schools vary wildly in quality here because each state maintains their own school system with their own standards, and then each city in that state kind of does the same thing. So you have some schools that teach really high quality, age appropriate sex education that's pretty standard stuff. And then you have schools teaching completely wacky nonsense, outdated things from the 40s. And then you have them teaching like hyper progressive, like gay stuff at 7 years old kind of schools. And there's a huge spectrum there. So obviously some of it is going to make some people very mad. And there are some parents that generally don't want any sex education for children in public schools, that is. That truly, when I say parents should choose what to teach their kids, they mean that all the way. That it's a strictly private thing for the home, not for the public, and not for the government. Similarly, there are beliefs that teaching gay history or the science of homosexuality is anti-religious or anti-scientific for that matter, and that it tempts kids to behave in a sexually active way earlier than they otherwise would have. Again, because you can't teach kids about sex and not expect them to mature over the course of that process. Another unpleasant but fairly widely held belief is that early exposure to LGBTQ material greatly increases the odds of the children themselves becoming some variety of rainbow later in life. This is, of course, viewed as a bad thing, and in a religious sense, a guaranteed ticket to hell. And it's also sort of a belief that if you expose kids to sex early, they're more likely to develop weird kinks and things like that because they kind of get imprinted on very, very young. Another big thing to talk about is the rapid evolution of gay rights and representation and discourse that has happened so fast it's shocking to me, and I'm not even particularly old. When I was in high school, which was about 20 years ago, there was no gay representation in media. There was no gay acceptance. There was none of this idea of, I don't care who you sleep with, just don't shove it in my face. And you'll hear this idea of like, I wish this blah, blah, blah didn't shove these politics in my face. I wish they weren't cramming gay stuff down our throats and stuff like that. And that's because society has moved from, and this is from my perspective when I was in high school, gay is bad. It's totally okay to beat up the gay kids. It's okay to do horrible things to the gay kids. And they're all going to hell anyway, so just go with it. To a broader acceptance of that community. And with that acceptance, you see a lot more things like, I don't care who you sleep with, or gay is okay, I just don't want to do it myself, and stuff like that. These kind of attitudes did not exist a very short window of time ago. And because of that increased acceptance, millennial and Gen Z population gayness is just like off the charts, like through the roof. Previously, about 2 to 5% of people would have identified as gay, but in the millennial and especially in the Gen Z community, that can be up to 35 to 40% now. An enormous amount of young people do not identify as cisgendered heterosexuals. This is at least partly because of the increased acceptance. Without that kind of acceptance, you wouldn't have this population explosion. And without that population explosion, you wouldn't have the demand for it, which is why there went from nothing to an astonishing amount really fast, give people whiplash and they don't like it. We're back on a different day for my personal opinions about all of this. Unfortunately, during the conservative section, I started losing my voice. I started needing more and more takes, sweating, getting a little bit more sick. So it took about a 15 hour break, and now I'm back to offer you my own personal opinions. The headsets and glasses and change in clothing is to try to hide a somewhat disheveled look because I didn't have time to take a full shower. So my personal opinion on this issue is that this type of discourse is very difficult to have without denigrating people. It's difficult to have without insulting or offending the gay community, and it's also difficult to have without stereotyping or strawmanning every single conservative as bigoted when that's probably not true. Social media makes this much, much harder because even this is an expression on social media, but Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all of that is designed to take an idea, shrink it down to its bare minimum components, and then the algorithms work primarily on rage bait, emotional baiting, neurohacking, and all that kind of stuff. So the spicier, the wilder, the crazier the discussion that you're having, the more views it's going to get, which is counterproductive to anything in society. So for Nickmercs himself, he probably was just regurgitating some stuff that he saw on other social media news. There are dozens and dozens of Twitter and political channels and other YouTube channels and stuff that say the same thing over and over and over and over again. And he was probably just spitting that right back out, and probably does believe that gays have nefarious intentions for his children based on the other tweets. Because of this, I think it's entirely appropriate that the gay community push back. They should push back. They should push back every time to try to squash this terrible scapegoating of all gays are groomers, because that is literally deadly. Like, that type of misinformation isn't just like a slur, an insult. It usually builds up to criminalization of a group of people or attacks on those group of people, very real physical attacks. A lot of people would tell me that's not true. We don't beat up gays anymore. More commonly, you see people say things like, I don't care who you have sex with, but blah, 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 blah. And the reality is that's a very new thing. I talked about this earlier. This whole attitude of it's okay if you want to sleep with dudes, just don't do it in front of my kids or keep it away from me or that kind of thing it actually reminds me a little bit of I don't care what color you are, blah, 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 blah. But that didn't used to be a thing, ladies and gentlemen. A very short period of time ago, I grew up being rewarded for bullying gays. I bullied gay kids. I did terrible, terrible things to people, and I was rewarded for it. I'm not proud of that. I'm actually pretty ashamed of that now as an adult. But I'm not exactly elderly, I'm not exactly old. And that type of thing still exists in certain families, in certain communities, in certain regions, in certain social groups. The idea that it is okay to be gay does not exist for some people, and it probably will continue to not exist for some time. And those ideas didn't just go away in the last couple of decades. They didn't just like totally disappear and feather out into the darkness while everybody matured thanks to social media. They just kind of went in the closet. And I've seen some of them firsthand in the 2010s and 2020s, and it's bad. It's really bad. I mean, I can tell stories from my siblings and some of the other people that I know in that community that have been discriminated against or threatened, but those aren't necessarily my stories to tell. I do believe that there is an absurd fascination with other people's private parts that is getting really, really out of hand. There are states and schools and organizations that do hormone testing. They want period tracking apps. They're trying to legally codify what is a sex and what is a gender without considering intersex people. There is the transvestigator movement. That's kind of disgusting in a lot of ways. Oddly gay too, to just sit around and like stare at people and see if they have dicks or not. Just seems like something a closeted gay person would do. Personally, I don't have time for that kind of nonsense. I don't know, it just seems bizarre to me that everybody wants to know your gender, they want to know your orientation, they want to know about your genitals, they want to argue about it. And this is a topic that affects a very small percentage of the overall population, yet it's one that gets a hugely disproportionate amount of attention. And about 95% of the time, I side with the gay community on these issues. About 95% of the time, they're the ones being discriminated against. They're the ones being harassed. They're the ones trying to mind their own business when something really bad happens. Not always, though. No community is flawless. I've seen all sorts of inappropriate and clowny stuff from the LGBTQ community, ranging from a variety of embarrassing pride parades that turned into kink parades, wildly inappropriate public displays of affection at said parade that tends to set back the gay community another year. There's a lot of very curious things about the natural state of humanity, and I have personally been flamed by friends and family for my orientation, because apparently it's like not okay to be straight. It's like, for me as a guy, it's not okay that I don't want to sleep with men or trans women or any of the other people on that spectrum, that makes me a bad person because I don't want that. And I've had to go through that personally. We might make a video about that later. That was kind of a very, very unpleasant situation to be in. So taking a step back, yeah, the gay community is usually the one that I stand with outside of a handful of issues. And right now in society, they've just replaced blacks and Mexicans as US's top scapegoat. So growing up as a little kid, I remember the bad guys, the scapegoats, were blacks, Satanists, blacks again, Mexicans, and now gay people. And that cycle just keeps on going for whoever is the number one evil in America. And I do believe that how we treat the LGBTQ community will define us in history and radically change the trajectory of our country, because this is a flashpoint in our society. This is a real nodal point, if you're familiar with the reference. This is an extremely important decision, because LGBT issues kind of test out the fabric of our secular government. LGBT in and of itself, being gay and legalizing homosexuality, is like a living, breathing, is it theodicy is the right word? It's like a proof of God. It's like, if God is all good, then how can there be evil? little things like that. Like if God says everybody is, marriage is for man and woman, then how come the science indicates that some people are born gay or born with a very high propensity for becoming gay? So it kind of puts this big burden of theological proof on the church. And the church, especially in the digital age, can't just change their mind and say, we were wrong, it's okay to be gay, and keep moving like everything's fine. They've kind of picked a decision that it's not okay, and now they have to prove it and stick with it, and that's a really hard one. You've just generally got science versus religion. There's religious beliefs that the propensity of homosexuality causes natural disasters or AIDS or other bad things to happen in society. The science aspect of it is that some people are born gay, born likely to be gay. There's different types of hormones and imprintation and stuff that can go on, and religion has opposite answers to that. Then there's battles on gender. Like, what is a gender is a very difficult thing that we're going to have to really define in the future, because right now most people use gender and sex kind of interchangeably, which is why you frequently hear only two genders, blah blah blah, because there's only two sexes, except for all those people with intersex disorders, of course. But it's a battle of defining gender roles. What's appropriate for people that want to take a social role as a man or woman? What is the role of the state in marriage and relationships? What is the role of the state in creating what is the standard building block of societal structure? Like, should the state have a say in your marriage or your relationships in any capacity as it relates to how they have to manage society and population growth and stuff like that? It's difficult decisions. I mean, this even builds up to challenging marriage, to challenging the structure of society, how we want to build our families, what people's rights and rules are and stuff like that. And of course, left versus right. So how we decide to treat gay people in this country will ultimately decide the course of the country. I believe that if we choose to criminalize homosexuality, we have thrown a huge portion of our Constitution in the garbage and decided that it is okay to allow religion to take a seat in government and to dictate what people should and should not do in their private lives. And I think that's a very, very bad thing. I'm definitely more on the left-wing side of this, because I believe that protecting marginalized groups, even if they're unpopular, even if there's not a lot of them, even if they rub shoulders the wrong way with almost every major religion, is a very important thing to do in a secular society, because what we do for the least of us, we do for ourselves. And the protections that we offer to the least of us are the same protections that we later get. And if we don't offer those and don't hold those up, then when the time comes, we may not have them as well. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something useful. The back half was pretty challenging. I think I'm getting another round of sickness here, which really sucks. But I hope you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.